The palace was not built for screams. Its corridors were designed for diplomacy, for footsteps measured in ceremony, for voices lowered in reverence. Marble does not tremble easily. Stone does not panic. And yet, on that night, something pierced the stillness so sharply that even the portrait seemed to listen. A child's voice, small, desperate, repeating one name through a locked door. Camilla! The cry echoed down a private corridor reserved for royalty alone, a place guarded not just by men in uniform, but by centuries of unbreakable protocol. Inside those walls, privacy was sacred. No guard entered without permission. No threshold was crossed without command. But the screaming did not stop. It rose, cracked, and turned into something no training manual could ignore. Boots struck marble. Radios whispered. A decision hovered in the air, heavy as history itself. Because forcing that door open would mean breaking a rule older than the guards who enforced it. Yet leaving it closed would mean ignoring a child in fear. And in that suspended moment, between duty and humanity, one choice would fracture more than wood. The courtyard was silent when it began. Night had settled over the palace with ceremonial precision. Lamps burned low along the corridors. Marble floors reflected golden light in long, unbroken lines. Beyond the tall windows, the city breathed at a distance, unaware that inside these guarded walls, something was about to rupture the calm. Then came the scream. High, sharp, unmistakably a child. It ricocheted down the private corridor of the royal residence, a space reserved for family, sealed by layers of discretion and guarded by men trained to respond to threat without hesitation. But this was not an explosion, not an alarm, not the crack of intrusion. It was a voice. Camilla! The name echoed again, thinner this time, fractured by panic. Two guards stationed at the end of the hall stiffened instantly. Their eyes met, not in confusion, but in recognition. The sound had come from the princess's private suite. They moved without speaking. Boots struck marble in synchronized rhythm, measured but urgent. Discipline kept their pace controlled. Even as the scream rose again, trembling against stone. At the bathroom door, they stopped, locked. Inside, something shifted, a metallic clatter, then another cry. Please. The younger guard exhaled slowly, steadying himself. Sir, Sergeant Alistair Rowan stood rigid, listening. 22 years in service had taught him to separate imagination from danger, but there was no mistaking what he heard. Fear, raw and escalating. He knocked firmly. Your Royal Highness? This is security. Please respond. No answer. Only another scream, closer now to breaking. Protocol pressed against him like a physical weight. Royal private quarters could not be entered without authorization. Privacy was not courtesy within these walls. It was doctrine. A violation would trigger inquiry, documentation, review. But the sound inside was not subsiding. Rowan tapped the secure channel on his shoulder. Control, this is Rowan. Audible distress from Princess's suite, requesting immediate assessment. A pause crackled in his earpiece. Define distress. Sustained screaming. No verbal response. Unknown interior status. Silence again. Then, stand by for instruction. Inside the bathroom, something struck tile. The cry that followed was hoarse. Camilla! The name hung in the corridor like a fracture in glass. Rowan stepped closer to the door. His palm hovered over the handle. Locked from within. Control, he said, voice steady despite the tension coiling in his chest. Initiating child safety provision 4. That provision existed for moments precisely like this. Rare, contested, heavy with consequence. Forced entry into a royal chamber without sovereign clearance. Permitted only when credible harm was suspected. Sergeant, Control replied carefully, you understand escalation requires written justification and internal review. Yes. And if no threat is found, I will accept responsibility. Another scream cut through the air. That was enough. Rowan stepped back once. The younger guard mirrored him. The first strike landed against solid oak with controlled force. The door shuddered but held. The second strike splintered the frame. The third shattered the lock. The door swung inward. Light flooded the corridor, and the screaming stopped. Inside, The princess stood barefoot on cold tile. Her night dress was twisted in her hands, knuckles pale from gripping fabric too tightly. Tears streaked her cheeks. The tap in the sink ran unchecked, water spilling dangerously close to the edge. No intruder, no blood, no visible harm. Only a child trembling beneath unforgiving light. Rowan lowered himself immediately, posture shifting from authority to reassurance. "You are safe, Your Royal Highness." Her breathing came in broken bursts. "Where is she?" she demanded. "Who, ma'am?" "Camilla." The younger guard stepped forward, quietly, and turned off the tap. The room fell silent, except for the princess's uneven breath. Rowan softened his voice further. "Can you tell me what frightened you?" Her eyes darted toward the open doorway, toward the corridor now filled with the quiet gravity of breached privacy. She said, "I mustn't tell." The words landed differently. Rowan did not react outwardly. Years of service had trained his expression into calm neutrality. But something inside him tightened. "No one here will be angry," he said gently. She said, "I had to be brave." Her voice cracked. "But I didn't want to be brave." Behind Rowan, footsteps approached. Senior household staff alerted by the breach. A physician arrived within moments. The princess was guided carefully past the shattered door, wrapped in a blanket, escorted toward her bedroom. As she disappeared down the corridor, the broken frame remained, jagged with splintered outward, a visible scar against polished stone. Within 15 minutes, the palace machine awakened. Security logs activated. Timestamps recorded. Camera feeds reviewed in silent rooms below ground level. 2142, first audible scream. 2144, knock initiated. 2146, child safety provision 4 invoked. 2147, forced entry executed. Sergeant Rowan stood alone for a moment beside the damaged door. A senior security official approached him. "Report. Child distressed. No physical threat identified. Interior secure." "And the name?" Rowan did not hesitate. She called for Camilla. The official absorbed this without visible reaction. "Understood." Upstairs, in a softly lit sitting room, Camilla stood near a window overlooking the inner courtyard. She had been informed only minutes earlier. "A forced entry?" she asked evenly. "Yes, ma'am." The princess was heard screaming. "My name?" "Yes, ma'am." Camilla's posture did not shift. "I was in the west drawing room until 9:30. There are witnesses." "Of course." She folded her hands lightly. "Has she been injured?" "No physical harm observed." A faint pause. Then this will resolve quietly. Quietly. The word carried expectation. Meanwhile, the princess sat on her bed, physician beside her, nanny holding her hand. "Did someone hurt you?" the physician asked gently. She shook her head. "Did someone frighten you?" A pause. I didn't like what she said. "What did she say, darling?" "That brave girls don't cry." The nanny's grip tightened subtly. Silence followed, the kind that is not accusation, but recognition. Downstairs, Sergeant Rowan began his formal statement. "I assess sustained distress with no interior confirmation of safety," he dictated calmly. "Given the minor's vulnerability and absence of response, I authorize forced entry." "Would you repeat that decision?" the reviewing officer asked. "Yes." There was no bravado in his voice, only certainty. Hours passed. The broken door was removed carefully, almost ceremonially. Replacement would come by morning. Damage erased. Surfaces restored. But something intangible lingered. Near midnight, the corridor stood empty again. Lamps dimmed. Footsteps ceased. Rowan resumed his post. The marble had been cleaned of splinters. The air held its composure once more. Yet the silence felt thinner. He replayed the words in his mind. She said, "I mustn't tell." It was not an accusation, not proof of wrongdoing. It was a child struggling with expectation. Still, expectation carries weight within these walls. Because in a monarchy, even tone can echo like command. By dawn, senior aides would convene quietly. Reports would be reviewed not for scandal, but for risk. Not for blame, but for fracture. Was this panic born of imagination or pressure? Was it misunderstanding or misjudgment. The princess slept at last, exhaustion overtaking fear. In dreams, marble corridors soften, titles dissolve, voices become simply voices. But adults do not sleep so easily when protocol has been broken. In an office lined with leather-bound archives, a notation was added to the security ledger. Privacy breach, justified under Child Safety Provision 4. Review required. The language was clinical. The implications were not, because privacy inside these walls was sacred. But so was protection. And when those two principles collide, someone must decide which bends. As first light touched the palace windows, illuminating stone that had witnessed generations of quiet power, Sergeant Rowan remained at his station. He had followed instinct over hierarchy, human need over rigid code. He did not regret it, but he understood the cost. Behind him, the repaired door stood freshly installed, seamless, polished, indistinguishable from the rest. Only those who were present would remember the sound it made when it splintered. Only those who heard the scream would understand why. And somewhere deeper within the palace, beyond marble and memory, a question had begun to form, not about security, not about discipline, but about what it means to tell a child to be brave inside walls built on restraint. The palace had regained its composure. Order had returned, yet something fragile had surfaced, a reminder that behind ceremony lives vulnerability, and behind titles live children who still cry in the dark. And as morning unfolded with practiced elegance, one truth remained unsettled. The princess had not called for help in general. She had called one name, and by the end of the day, that name would carry weight far heavier than a broken door. As internal reports begin to circulate and quiet questions rise to the palace hierarchy, the breach itself becomes secondary, because what happened behind that door was not an attack. It was a signal, and the institution must now decide how to interpret it. The corridor had been repaired before sunrise. By the time the household staff resumed their morning routines, there was no visible trace of the fractured door. The hinges were polished. The wood matched perfectly. Even the scent of fresh varnish had been neutralized. On the surface, the palace had returned to order. But beneath that composure, something had shifted. In the lower-level security office, a space without windows, lined with monitors and leather-bound protocol manuals. The review had already begun. Timestamps flickered across screens. 2142. Initial scream detected on corridor microphone. 2143. Guard movement initiated. 2146. Child Safety Provision 4 invoked. 2147. Forced entry executed. Every second mattered. Not because of scandal. Because of precedent. Sergeant Alistair Rowan stood before a long oak table, uniform pressed, posture rigid. Across from him sat the deputy marshal of the household, a man whose authority rested not in public recognition, but in centuries of codified discretion. "State your reasoning again," the deputy marshal said calmly. Rowan did not falter. Sustained distress. No response to verbal identification. Audible impact within chamber. Minor occupant. Risk threshold met. Visible threat? None confirmed prior to entry. And yet you proceeded. Yes. The deputy marshal folded his hands. You understand that privacy within the family wing is not merely etiquette. It is constitutional custom. I do. And if the princess had simply been frightened by imagination, Rowan held the gaze evenly. Fear is not imaginary to a child, sir. Silence followed, not disapproval, but evaluation, because within these walls, protocol was designed to prevent overreaction. Guards were trained to contain, not escalate. The monarchy endured precisely because chaos was absorbed before it surfaced. But the previous night had tested that containment. Meanwhile, 2 floors above, senior aides gathered in a narrower chamber lined with framed royal charters. No cameras, no transcripts, only measured voices. The name was repeated multiple times. One aide stated quietly, "Yes." And Her Majesty was accounted for at the time. Confirmed. Witnesses present. Then the distress was emotional. Another pause. Emotional disturbances were more complex than physical threats. They left no fingerprints. No broken windows. Only interpretation. What exactly did the princess say? a senior advisor asked. A file was opened. Handwritten notes from the attending physician were read carefully. She reported being told that brave girls do not cry. She expressed reluctance to be brave. She indicated she had been instructed not to tell. The room remained still, not because the words were explosive, because they were subtle. And subtlety, within a monarchy, often carried more consequence than noise. Down the corridor, a chambermaid was quietly interviewed. "Did you notice anything unusual earlier in the evening?" "No, sir." "Any raised voices?" "No." "Did the princess appear distressed during supper?" "She was quiet, sir, but not distressed. Quiet." Another detail logged. Security footage from the West drawing room confirmed Camilla's presence there until 9:30. Conversations appeared cordial. Staff moved in and out. Nothing abrupt. Nothing alarming. On screen, she looked composed, as always, yet composition does not measure emotional impact. In her private sitting room, Camilla reviewed the morning brief with controlled patience. "A full internal review?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am. Standard procedure following forced entry." "And the guard?" "Sergeant Rowan stands by his decision." Camilla nodded once. "He is correct to protect a child," she said evenly. "That is his duty." Her tone neither defensive nor apologetic. "Will there be further inquiry into my conversation with her?" she asked. "Possibly, ma'am, for clarity." Another pause. "Then clarity shall be provided." But clarity is rarely simple when emotion is involved. Late morning light filled the princess's bedroom gently. The curtains had been drawn back just enough to allow warmth without glare. She sat at a small writing desk, crayons arranged neatly before her. Her nanny knelt beside her. "Would you like to draw what frightened you?" The princess considered this, then shook her head. "It wasn't something," she whispered. It was how she said it. The nanny absorbed this carefully. How did she say it? She said if I cried, people would think I was weak. The word weak lingered in the room like an unfamiliar guest. Children inside palaces grow quickly accustomed to expectation. They wave before they understand history. They stand still when photographers call. They learn posture before they learn algebra. But they are still children. In the security office, attention shifted to guard rotation logs. Each shift change was documented to the minute. Movement within private wings required clearance at multiple points. A junior officer leaned closer to the screen. "Sir," the deputy marshal approached. "There's a minor alteration in the 2030 corridor rotation." Define alteration. Guard Bennett was scheduled for inner post until 2100 hours. He was relieved at 2037. Authorize. Yes. Clearance code listed under senior household access. Which senior household member? The officer hesitated. Authorization attached to Her Majesty's staff office. Silence settled again, heavier this time. Not accusation. Simply fact. "Was this deviation within acceptable bounds?" the deputy marshal asked. "Yes, sir. High-level clearance permits adjustment without security objection." "Then why note it?" "Because it narrows the window during which the princess was unattended in corridor adjacency." The deputy marshal considered this carefully. A shift altered by 7 minutes would not ordinarily raise concern. Yet in investigations, timing becomes narrative. "Continue review," he said quietly. Upstairs, Camilla requested a private audience with the princess. It was granted. The meeting took place in a sunlit sitting room, not the previous night's bathroom, deliberately chosen for neutrality. The princess entered first, holding her nanny's hand. Camilla remained seated until she approached, then rose gracefully. "My dear," she said gently, "I heard you were frightened." The princess looked down at her shoes. "I mean to scream." "You are allowed to scream if you are afraid," Camilla replied evenly. A small pause. "Did I frighten you yesterday?" she asked. The princess hesitated. "You said I had to be brave." "Yes. And that brave girls don't cry." Camilla's expression softened, almost imperceptibly. "I meant that bravery means facing hard moments," she said carefully, "not hiding from them. But I was scared." "And that is allowed," Camilla answered. The conversation was calm, measured, no raised voices. No visible hostility. Yet meaning rests not only in words spoken, but in how they are received. When the meeting concluded, Camilla returned to her office with deliberate composure. She misunderstood encouragement as command, she stated to her aide. Yes, ma'am. And that misunderstanding led to breach of security. Indirectly, yes. Camilla stood by the window, overlooking the courtyard, where flags moved gently in morning wind. Then we must correct misunderstanding, she said. Downstairs, Sergeant Rowan completed his final written statement. The deputy marshal read it in silence. Would you alter your decision knowing there was no physical threat? He asked one final time. Rowan's voice remained steady. No, sir. The marshal closed the file. Then the breach stands as justified under Child Protection Clause. A subtle exhale passed through the room. Not relief, recognition. The institution had bent, but not broken. Still, questions remained. Why had the princess felt she could not speak? Why had bravery sounded like instruction rather than reassurance? And why had a minor shift change occurred just before the incident? None of these elements proved wrongdoing, but together, they formed a pattern worthy of scrutiny. By late afternoon, the palace resumed full rhythm. Visitors arrived. Meetings proceeded. Smiles were practiced beneath chandeliers. Outwardly, nothing had occurred. Yet internally, files were marked confidential. Rotation schedules were re-evaluated. Child sensitivity protocols quietly drafted for review, because within royal households, reform rarely arrives through scandal. It arrives through quiet correction. As dusk approached once more, the corridor outside the princess's suite stood calm. Guards resumed position. Their boots echoed evenly against marble. Sergeant Rowan stood at post, gazed forward. Protocol had been defended. Humanity had been honored. But something lingered, not suspicion, not accusation, simply awareness. A child's fear had forced an institution to examine itself. And institutions, once examined, do not return unchanged. Behind closed doors that evening, a sealed internal memo was placed on the deputy marshal's desk. Subject, corridor rotation variance. 2030 adjustment. It was minor, almost invisible. But when opened, it would reveal that the authorization code attached to the shift change had been logged twice. Once manually, once digitally. A duplication not typical within standard clearance procedure. Not proof, but irregular. And in a palace where every detail is deliberate, irregularities demand explanation. The marble halls remained silent. But beneath that silence, inquiry deepened. Because sometimes the most consequential moments are not the scream itself, but the quiet decisions that preceded it. The memo did not look dangerous. It was a single sheet of cream-colored paper, marked confidential, placed carefully atop a stack of routine security briefings. No red ink, no urgent stamps. Just a notation regarding a duplicated authorization code attached to a minor corridor rotation change. Yet inside the palace, small irregularities carry disproportionate weight, because nothing within those walls is accidental. By mid-morning, the deputy marshal convened a restrictive review. Only 3 individuals were present, himself, the chief of household operations, and the private secretary to the crown. The room was narrow, its windows draped heavily against the light. Conversation here was never recorded. The duplication may be clerical, the chief of operations offered evenly, or deliberate, the private secretary replied. Explain, the marshal said quietly. The authorization for Guard Bennett's early relief was logged manually at 2031. The secretary began, glancing at the document, then digitally entered at 2036 under the same clearance signature. 5 minutes apart, the marshal noted. Yes. And the clearance signature? Assigned to Her Majesty's Senior Staff Office. Silence settled again. No one spoke the implication aloud. High-level clearance did not require explanation for minor shift adjustments. It was routine for senior aides to request temporary privacy within certain wings. The system was built on trust. But trust, once examined, becomes fragile. Has Her Majesty been informed of the duplication? The chief asked. Not yet, the secretary replied. The matter remained procedural at this stage. Procedural, a word chosen carefully, because once an issue became personal, it risked division. Meanwhile, in a private morning audience room lined with ancestral portraits, Camilla sat opposite the private secretary. She listened without interruption as the duplicated log entry was explained. Her expression did not harden. It did not soften. It remained composed. "You are suggesting," she said evenly, "that someone in my office altered a guard rotation prior to the incident. We are suggesting only that the duplication is unusual," the secretary clarified. "Nothing more." "Who executed the entry?" "A junior administrative officer under your senior aide." Camilla considered this, then questioned the officer. "They have been interviewed. They insist the digital entry was corrective, not duplicative." "Corrective of what?" "A manual note that had not yet populated the system." A pause. "So the alteration was procedural housekeeping." "That is their statement." Camilla rose slowly and walked toward the tall windows overlooking the courtyard. Below, ceremonial guards stood immobile beneath the pale winter sun. "You are aware," she said quietly, "that this incident began with a child frightened by tone." "Yes." "And now we are discussing clearance codes." "That is the nature of internal review, ma'am." She turned back toward him. "Then review thoroughly," she said. "But do not confuse clerical tidiness with conspiracy." Her voice was calm, controlled, yet beneath composure lay something less visible. Irritation not at accusation, but at implication. Upstairs, the princess met again with the palace physician. This time not in crisis, but in conversation. "You said you were told not to tell," the physician said gently. "What did that mean?" The princess traced her finger along the edge of the armchair. "She said that brave girls keep family matters private." "Did she say you would be punished if you told?" "No." "Did she say you would disappoint her?" The princess hesitated. "She said people watch us, and I mustn't give them something to see." The physician wrote nothing for several seconds. "Did that frighten you?" "I thought if I cried, everyone would know." The physician nodded slowly. "Children born into public institutions learn visibility early. They understand that cameras exist even when unseen. But emotional nuance, the space between guidance and pressure, is harder to navigate." When the session concluded, the physician's report was delivered discreetly to household operations. Conclusion: no evidence of coercion. Emotional distress linked to perceived expectation of composure. Perceived expectation, not command. Perception, however, shapes reaction. By late afternoon, the review expanded quietly. Interviews with household staff continued, not interrogations, but clarifications. A footman recalled seeing the princess leave the drawing room slightly withdrawn. A lady's maid mentioned that Camilla's tone had been firm, but not severe. No one described hostility. No one described threat. Yet, collectively, they described an atmosphere of weight. Inside institutions built on dignity, weight accumulates invisibly. In the security office, Sergeant Rowan was asked to recount once more the sequence before forced entry. "Did you consider waiting an additional 30 seconds?" the deputy marshal asked. "No, sir." "Why?" "Because hesitation in matters involving minors compounds risk." "And you believed risk existed?" "Yes." The marshal studied him. "You have served the crown for 2 decades." "Yes, sir." "Does loyalty ever conflict with instinct?" Rowan did not answer immediately. "Loyalty protects the institution," he said carefully. "Instinct protects the vulnerable. And when those priorities diverge, then a decision must be made." The marshal closed the file. "Your decision stands." Elsewhere, whispers began among junior staff, not gossip, but curiosity. Why had a routine conversation escalated into emergency? Why had the princess felt compelled to scream a single name repeatedly? And why had a minor guard adjustment preceded the event? None of these questions carried accusation, but together they formed tension. As evening approached, a private family gathering was convened. Small, contained, shielded from formal record. Present were senior members of the household. No aides, no officers, only family. The atmosphere was restrained. Camilla spoke first. "I am told my encouragement was received as pressure," she said evenly. "That was not my intention." No one interrupted. The princess sat quietly, hands folded in her lap. A senior royal voice responded, calm, steady. Intent does not erase effect. The words were neither hostile nor sympathetic. They were factual. Camilla inclined her head slightly. I regret if my tone carried weight it was not meant to. The princess looked up briefly. I didn't want to disappoint you, she whispered. The room stilled. Disappointment, Camilla said gently, is not born of tears. A pause. Then why say brave girls don't cry? The child asked softly. Because sometimes children ask questions adults cannot soften. Camilla inhaled slowly. I said bravery means continuing even when you feel like crying, she clarified. Not that you must never cry. The princess considered this. The difference between never and continue is small to adults. To children, it is vast. Silence lingered, not accusatory, not forgiving, simply reflective. The gathering ended without confrontation, but emotional lines had been drawn. Loyalty to family, loyalty to institution, loyalty to perception, all coexisting, yet not always aligned. That night, the private secretary drafted a preliminary internal recommendation, reinforced child-sensitive language guidance within senior household interactions, standardized guard rotation logging to prevent duplication ambiguity, maintain confidentiality to avoid unnecessary speculation. The draft was sealed for review, but before submission, a final envelope arrived at the deputy marshal's desk. It contained a transcript excerpt, overlooked in the initial physician's notes. A single additional line spoken by the princess during her first distress moments. She said, people already think I'm weak. The marshal read it twice. There had been no public commentary, no external criticism directed at the child. So, where had that perception originated? From imagination? From observation? Or from subtle commentary overheard? He closed the file slowly, because the issue was no longer about a broken door. It was about internal culture. Inside a monarchy, image is curated meticulously. Strength is projected deliberately. Weakness is managed privately. But when strength becomes expectation for a child, it risks becoming burden. As night settled once more over the palace, the marble corridors stood serene again. Guards maintained position. Doors remained intact. Yet beneath composure, emotional fracture lines glowed faintly. Not scandal, not crisis, but division of interpretation. Camilla believed she had encouraged resilience. The princess had felt instructed to suppress vulnerability. The guard had chosen protection over protocol. The institution now stood at a crossroads, not publicly, but philosophically. Does loyalty require silence, or does loyalty require correction? In a palace built on continuity, change rarely arrives loudly. It arrives through quiet recalibration. And somewhere within the sealed internal report awaiting final signature lay a detail, small, procedural, easily overlooked, that would soon shift the conversation from misunderstanding to accountability. Because the duplicated authorization code had not originated from clerical correction after all. A time-stamped backend review revealed that the digital entry had been initiated remotely from a secondary terminal, one not located within Camilla's immediate staff office. It had been executed by someone with extended clearance privileges, someone close enough to the crown to access restricted systems. And that discovery would not remain procedural for long. As the origin of the duplicated clearance code is traced to a secondary terminal within senior access range, the question shifts from miscommunication to motive, and what lies inside the sealed internal report may divide the household more deeply than the scream ever did. The report was sealed at 7:15. Cream parchment, embossed insignia, marked for senior review only. It did not accuse. It did not dramatize. It documented. And yet, within its measured language lay the kind of truth that institutions rarely confront willingly. Not because it is explosive, but because it is human. The secondary terminal had been identified, located not in Camilla's primary office, but in an adjoining administrative chamber, accessible only to senior aides with extended clearance. The digital duplication of the guard rotation had been entered from that terminal at precisely 2036. 5 minutes after the manual note, the aide responsible, Eleanor Whitcomb, 29 years in royal service, had come forward voluntarily once confronted with the time stamp. Her explanation was simple. I adjusted the rotation to reduce corridor presence for half an hour, she said evenly. Her Majesty had requested a private conversation with the princess earlier in the evening. I believe minimizing visible security would provide comfort. You did not inform security control, the deputy marshal replied. I operated within clearance authority. That is not the question. Eleanor did not shift under scrutiny. I acted in good faith, and that, in many ways, was the complication, because good faith can still create unintended consequence. The sealed report now reframed the narrative. There had been no hidden motive, no deliberate isolation, no conspiracy, only an administrative decision made in deference to perceived emotional sensitivity. Yet that decision narrowed the corridor coverage window, reducing visible reassurance outside the princess's suite during the precise hour she would later panic. Small adjustments compounded. Meanwhile, the private secretary requested a formal audience with Camilla. The meeting took place in a narrower chamber beneath a vaulted ceiling painted centuries ago with allegorical scenes of justice and restraint. The irony did not go unnoticed. Your Majesty, the secretary began carefully, we have identified the origin of the duplicated entry. Camilla listened without interruption. It was entered by Ms. Wickham from the adjoining administrative terminal. She adjusted the guard presence in accordance with your earlier request for privacy. I requested privacy for conversation, Camilla replied calmly. Not reduction of security oversight. Understood. However, the adjustment was executed. A pause. And the princess was aware of reduced presence? Camilla asked, unlikely directly, but children noticed absence. Silence settled heavily between them. Camilla rose and walked slowly toward the window. The courtyard below shimmered faintly in afternoon light. So, she said at last, in seeking to provide gentleness, we removed reassurance. Yes, ma'am. The secretary did not embellish, because the truth required no dramatization. Inside a monarchy, privacy is often equated with protection. Yet for a child, protection sometimes looks like presence. The sealed report continued beyond administrative detail. It included a psychological assessment, discreet, respectful, precise. Conclusion. The princess experienced anticipatory anxiety related to perceived expectations of composure within public life. Conversation emphasizing bravery, combined with environmental reduction of visible security, contributed to escalation of emotional distress. Not blame, not fault, contribution. Camilla read the assessment alone later that evening. The room was quiet. No aides present. No witnesses to her expression. She paused at a line referencing perceived expectations. Perceived. The word lingered, because perception within royal life shapes reality more powerfully than instruction. She closed the folder slowly. For decades, she had navigated scrutiny sharper than most could endure. She had learned resilience not as encouragement, but as necessity. To her, bravery was armor, but armor placed upon a child can feel like weight. Elsewhere in the palace, Eleanor Wickham sat in a modest office awaiting formal disciplinary review. She did not appear fearful, only reflective. I believe fewer uniforms would make the conversation less intimidating, she said quietly to the reviewing officer. The princess has sometimes expressed discomfort with constant watch. You understand that reducing visibility without notifying security disrupts integrated protocol, the officer replied. Yes. Do you regret the decision? A pause. I regret the outcome. It was a kind of answer born of loyalty to both institution and individual. Late that night, a second, smaller addendum was attached to the sealed report. It contained a detail previously overlooked, noted by a junior archivist reviewing archived communication logs. Earlier that afternoon, prior to the conversation about bravery, Camilla had received a briefing summary regarding external media commentary speculating about the princess's temperament. The commentary was mild, nothing severe, but it had included the phrase sensitive disposition. Camilla had dismissed it publicly. Privately, she had requested the briefing not be shared with the child. Protection in her mind, shielding. Yet later, During their conversation, she had referenced the importance of strength under observation, unintentionally linking private media commentary with personal encouragement. The report did not accuse her of transference. It did not suggest intent, but it acknowledged context. Context changes tone. Tone shapes perception. Perception triggers reaction. And reaction, in this case, had led to a broken door. The following morning, a closed session was convened in the portrait gallery, chosen deliberately for its symbolism. Ancestors lined the walls, sovereigns who had faced crises far greater than emotional misunderstanding. Yet even those faces seemed to carry quiet recognition. Present were Camilla, the private secretary, the deputy marshal, and one senior royal whose authority balanced tradition with evolution. The sealed report was summarized aloud. No raised voices, no confrontation, only facts. When the section referencing media briefing context was read, Camilla did not interrupt. When the psychological assessment concluded, she nodded once. So this was not malice, she said softly, but miscalculation. Yes, the secretary replied. And the guard, his action stands justified. A longer pause followed. Then Camilla spoke in a tone less formal than usual. Resilience has sustained this family through centuries, but perhaps I forgot that resilience is learned gradually. The senior royal across from her answered evenly. Children are not symbols. They are children first. Silence again. The truth rarely needs embellishment. Then correction is required. Camilla said at last, not defensively, not reluctantly, simply as recognition. The sealed report concluded with recommendations. Reinforce guard visibility continuity, regardless of requested privacy, during child engagements. Introduce internal guidance on language framing for minors under public scrutiny. Establish confidential child advocacy liaison within the household. Reform quiet and precise, not because of scandal, but because of awareness. That evening, Camilla requested another brief meeting with the princess. No formal setting. No staff present beyond a discreet distance. They sat together in the conservatory, where winter light softened through glass. I spoke to you about bravery, Camilla began gently, and I realize now that I spoke from my own experience, not yours. The princess listened carefully. I did not mean for you to feel watched by expectation, Camilla continued. If you cry, it does not make you weak. The princess studied her face. Then what makes someone brave? She asked quietly. Camilla paused longer this time, admitting when they're frightened. The answer was not rehearsed. It carried weight. The princess nodded slowly. I was frightened. I know. A small moment, not dramatic, not public, but sincere. In the lower offices, the sealed report received final signature approval. It would not be archived publicly. It would not be leaked. It would not become rumor. But its impact would remain, because institutions evolve not only through crisis, but through introspection, and the monarchy, ancient as stone, had quietly recalibrated. The broken door had been repaired days ago, yet something more significant had shifted behind it. The realization that strength imposed too early becomes pressure, that privacy without presence becomes isolation, and that loyalty sometimes requires acknowledging unintended consequence. As evening fell once more over the palace, the marble corridors glowed with their familiar golden light. Guards stood in steady formation. Doors remained intact. But within the sealed report, now locked within the private archive, lay a record of something rare. Not scandal, not rebellion, but accountability. And accountability within a monarchy is not weakness. It is preservation. The palace did not announce reform. It absorbed it. By the time the final signature dried on the sealed report, the machinery of the household had already begun its quiet recalibration. No press release, no public acknowledgement, only subtle amendments woven into daily routine, adjustments so seamless they appeared inevitable rather than reactive. But behind that seamlessness lay a conversation that would determine whether this moment faded or endured. It took place in a private chamber rarely used for operational matters, a room beneath towering portraits of past sovereigns, kings who had navigated wars, queens who had endured exile. Their painted eyes seemed to observe the living with detached patience. Camilla entered first. Moments later, the senior royal joined her. No aides, no secretaries, no transcripts, only consequence. The report is thorough, the senior royal began evenly. Yes, Camilla replied. It concludes misjudgment, not misconduct. I agree. A pause. But misjudgment carries weight. The voice continued, especially when it involves a child. Camilla did not dispute this. I spoke from instinct, she said carefully, from experience shaped by scrutiny. I believed preparing her early would strengthen her. And instead, I made strength sound mandatory. The admission hung between them, not dramatic, not humiliating, simply honest. The senior royal stepped closer to one of the portraits, studying the image of a long-past monarch whose reign had survived crisis through adaptation rather than denial. The crown endures, the voice said quietly, because it listens before it fractures. Camilla understood the meaning, not reprimand, responsibility. Meanwhile, across the palace, Sergeant Rowan stood once more as a signpost outside the family wing. The repaired door gleamed under corridor light. If one did not know what had occurred days earlier, nothing appeared disturbed. Yet Rowan felt the subtle difference. The security briefing that morning had included new language, minor but deliberate. Guard visibility to remain continuous during minor family engagements unless direct sovereign override is confirmed through security control. No ambiguity. No informal adjustments. Presence was protection. Rowan read the line twice before closing the folder. Not vindication. Validation. In a smaller administrative office, Eleanor Wickham received formal notice of procedural censure. It was not dismissal, not demotion, but a recorded reprimand. She accepted it without protest. Your intent was not in question, the reviewing officer stated. But coordination failure created vulnerability. Yes, Eleanor replied quietly. And vulnerability within the family wing cannot rely on assumption. I understand. Her career would continue. Her loyalty remained intact. But the lesson would not be forgotten. Upstairs, the princess walked through conservatory accompanied by her nanny. Winter sunlight filtered through glass, warming the stone beneath their steps. She appeared lighter now, not because expectation had vanished, it never would, but because language had shifted. Camilla approached gently. No formal posture, no audience. I have been thinking about bravery, she said softly. The princess looked up. Bravery, Camilla continued, is not the absence of tears. It is choosing to speak even when your voice shakes. The princess considered this. Like when I screamed? She asked. Yes. Camilla answered without hesitation. Exactly like that. The moment did not erase what had happened, but it reframed it. And reframing within institutions is powerful. Later that afternoon, the final reform proposal was presented for signature, a quiet internal directive establishing a child advocacy liaison within the household, a confidential figure available solely for the emotional welfare of minor royals. It was unprecedented, not because children had been neglected before, but because the acknowledgement formalized what had long been assumed. Vulnerability deserved structure. The directive was signed without ceremony. No announcement followed. Yet history often turns on unannounced signatures. That evening, the senior royal requested one final gathering, informal, familial, free of advisors. The princess was present. Camilla was present. Silence was present. We all carry the crown differently, the senior voice began. Some by blood, some by marriage, some by duty. The princess listened intently. But no one carries alone. A pause. And no child carries it fully. The words settled gently. Camilla inclined her head. I will remember that, she said quietly. Across the room, Sergeant Rowan's name was mentioned, not publicly, not ceremonially, but in acknowledgement. He acted decisively, the senior royal stated. Protocol bent for protection. And it was right, Camilla added. Recognition travels quietly within palaces. Later that night, Rowan was informed formally that his decision had been upheld and commended internally for child safeguarding adherence. No medal, no press, only a line added to his service record. Demonstrated balanced judgment under institutional constraint. For a man of discipline, that was enough. As midnight approached, the palace settled into its familiar rhythm. Footsteps softened, lamps dimmed, marble returned to stillness. But beneath that stillness lay subtle transformation. The crown had not cracked. The institution had not fractured. Instead, it had adjusted, absorbing miscalculation and redistributing weight. Camilla stood alone for a moment before retiring for the evening. The courtyard below shimmered faintly in moonlight. Strength, she reflected, had always meant endurance to her. Silence, composure, resilience under scrutiny. But perhaps strength could also mean adaptation. The princess slept peacefully in her room, door intact, corridor visible beyond it, presence restored, expectation softened. Elsewhere, the sealed report was transferred from active review into archival containment. Restricted access, private classification. It would not gather dust. It would serve as reference. Because institutions remember quietly. As dawn prepared once more to touch the palace towers, the weight of the crown remained what it had always been. Heavy, complex, symbolic. But now it rested on foundations, slightly more aware. The scream that had once shattered silence had not weakened the monarchy. It had reminded it that legacy is not maintained by suppressing vulnerability, but by protecting it. And as the first light broke across marble floors once again, the palace stood unchanged in structure, yet subtly altered in spirit. The marble remembers. It remembers footsteps measured in ceremony. It remembers whispered negotiations beneath chandeliers. It remembers moments of triumph and seasons of quiet endurance. And now, it remembers a scream, not as scandal, not as rupture, but as reminder. Morning light pours once more through the tall, arched windows of the palace. The corridors are calm. Guards stand motionless. Polished boots align with geometric precision. Portraits gaze down from gilded frames, their painted expressions unchanged by the events of the previous week. To an outside observer, nothing is different. The crown glints as it always has. The gates open and close with practiced rhythm. Visitors arrive. Meetings proceed. Speeches are drafted in careful ink. But within institutions built on tradition, transformation rarely announces itself. It settles quietly into structure. In the security office below ground level, the revised protocol manual now contains a single added paragraph, brief, deliberate. Visible guard presence shall remain continuous during engagements involving minor family members unless direct sovereign override is formally logged through security control. It is not dramatic language, but it shifts emphasis. Presence is not intrusion. Presence is assurance. Sergeant Rowan reads a line one final time before closing the manual. He does not consider himself central to change. He sees only that his decision has been absorbed into policy. That is enough. In another wing, the Child Advocacy Liaison Office has been quietly established. A modest room, warm lighting, shelves of books rather than ledgers. It will not appear on public diagrams of the palace. It exists without fanfare. Yet it stands as acknowledgement that children within ancient institutions require modern sensitivity. The princess visits that room once in the weeks that follow, not because she is distressed, but because she is invited. She sits cross-legged on a rug and speaks about schoolwork, about horses, about the weight of waving from balconies. Do people expect me not to cry? She asks at one point. They expect you to be human. The liaison answers gently. The answer is simple, but simplicity within royal life can be revolutionary. Elsewhere, Camilla walks alone through the portrait gallery late one evening. The palace is hushed, the echo of her steps softened by thick carpets laid long before her time. She pauses before an image of a queen who reigned during upheaval, a sovereign remembered not for perfection, but for adaptation. Camilla studies the painted face thoughtfully. Resilience had once meant stillness to her, composure beneath scrutiny, endurance without visible fracture. But resilience can also mean revision, a willingness to examine tone, to recalibrate expectation, to listen when instinct proves incomplete. She does not speak these thoughts aloud. They settle inward. In the days following the incident, no public narrative emerges. There are no leaks, no speculation. The monarchy remains intact in the public imagination. But strength is not defined solely by what remains unseen. It is defined by what is learned. The senior royal who presided over the private accountability meeting stands at a window overlooking the courtyard one morning. The princess crosses the stones below, escorted but visible. She laughs at something her nanny says. Laughter returns easily to children. The senior royal reflects on legacy. The crown is often mistaken for permanence. Stone, gold, ceremony. But in truth, it is adaptation that sustains it. Every generation adjusts imperceptibly to survive. Every crisis, however small, reveals fault lines that must be tended before they widen. A scream behind a locked door will not enter history books, but its echo has already altered internal understanding. In the security office, Eleanor Whitcomb resumes her duties. Her reprimand remains in her file, a reminder not of disloyalty, but of coordination's importance. She reviews clearance requests more carefully now, double-checks digital entries, confirms manual logs, not out of fear, out of awareness. Because in a palace where detail equals stability, precision is devotion. One evening, as twilight drapes the courtyard in muted violet, the princess stands again in the conservatory. Camilla joins her. They do not revisit the incident directly. Instead, they speak of upcoming engagements, of school recitals, of weather forecasts. Ordinary conversation. Yet beneath it lies quiet understanding. I practice not crying today. The princess says suddenly. Camilla pauses. And how did that feel? Hard. A gentle smile touches Camilla's expression. Perhaps practice speaking when you want to cry. She replies. That might be braver. The princess considers this thoughtfully. Then I will practice that instead. A small exchange, but it signals something significant. Bravery redefined, not as silence, but as expression. Night settles again over the palace. Guards rotate posts with precise timing. Corridor lights dim in sequence. The repaired bathroom door stands solid, indistinguishable from any other. Only those present that night remember the sound it made when it gave way. Only they understand the weight of choosing humanity over hierarchy. Sergeant Rowan pauses briefly outside the family wing before resuming his patrol. His service continues unchanged in appearance. Yet he carries a subtle certainty now that discipline and compassion are not opposites. They are partners. Deep within the private archive, the sealed report rests among documents chronicling wars, abdications, reforms. It will not be read often, but it exists as testament that even ancient systems can learn from small voices. The palace at dawn is beautiful in its stillness. Marble glowing pale beneath rising sun. Flags unfurling gently above stone battlements. From a distance, it appears immovable. But within its walls, adjustments have taken root. Expectations softened. Language reconsidered. Protection clarified. The monarchy endures not because it is flawless. It endures because it listens, because it bends before it breaks, because it understands that legacy is not preserved through rigidity alone. It is preserved through reflection. And somewhere within those quiet corridors, a child who once screamed now walks with steadier steps. Not because she has learned not to cry, but because she knows she will be heard as she does. The marble remembers, not the fracture of wood, not the panic of that night, but the choice made in its aftermath. A choice to protect vulnerability within power. A choice to measure strength not by silence, but by response. As the sun rises fully and the palace resumes its timeless rhythm, the echo of that scream fades into memory. Yet its lesson remains. Duty is not merely ceremonial. It is human, and within even the grandest halls, the smallest voice can reshape the weight of a crown. The corridors are silent once more. The marble gleams. The crown endures. And tomorrow, another moment will test the balance between tradition and humanity. Not through fear this time, but through love.